Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and today I'm here to talk about the Infernoid cards that are being released in Battles of Legend Terminal's Revenge, which has support for the Infernoid archetype, which is my favorite archetype, and I've been playing it for years. I have a regional top with it. So I just want to go over some tips regarding the new Void cards, as well as some discussions regarding the combos. So here we go. We're going to start off with the first new spell card. Void Reignition is a normal spell card with 2 effects, and will be played post Terminal's Revenge. Its first card effect is just card destruction, but just for you. You just have to reveal an Infernoid in your hand or a Void card in your hand, and you'll discard every card in your hand and draw a new card for each card that you discarded. Anytime you discard an Infernoid, you've effectively gone plus because the Infernoids in your hand don't really do anything, with the exception of trying to hard summon Infernoid Evil. By activating the card destruction effect, you will be negging your hand by 1 card because you'll have 1 less card, because you won't be drawing a card for the Void Reignition that you activated to the field, so you will be minusing a card every time you activate it. You could even save cards that you need, whether it be power 1 of spell cards like your Void Vanishment by setting them before you activate the card, and the goal is to really dig into the power 1 card starters that you might be playing, as there will be 1 card combos using things like Snake Eye Ash, as well as some combos using the Fiendsmith engine once that stuff is released in Infinite Forbidden. And this effect is not once per turn, so if you don't draw into what you need off of the first one, you can activate another one, although again, your hand will continue to get smaller and smaller, but as long as you're discarding Infernoids in the process of trying to draw more cards, it's probably worth doing. The second effect of this card is once per duel, which of course means that it is really good. You don't put once per duel effects on cards that are really bad. So the effect of this card in the graveyard says, other than the turn that this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target up to 11 Infernoids with different names and return them to the graveyard. So this means that you can spend your entire first turn setting up whatever board you want, wasting all the Infernoids you possibly can, and then starting your next turn, you can simply return 11 of them as long as they have different names from the graveyard, from your banishment to the graveyard. Now, if this card wasn't once per duel and you activated multiples of these on your first turn trying to set up your plays, you'd be able to return your Infernoids turn after turn and never run out of monsters. Odds are if you can resolve this 3 times, you definitely win the duel. But I mean, if you resolve it once, you should win the duel. So being once per duel really shouldn't matter. It just means that it gives you an alternative to needing to refill your graveyard than top decking Decatron or Imagination and being able to resolve their effects by simply returning the cards that are already banished to the graveyard. This does fix one issue that you had in Infernoids, which is that you'd often have to save some monsters in the graveyard to use on the next turn, but knowing that you can just return whatever you need on the following turn could be a big lifestyle improvement. You don't have to suffer in this particular issue by holding on to these Infernoids. You can just waste them and then bring them back later, assuming your opponent can't deal with the fact that you have this card in the graveyard, and it's not likely that people will be able to negate it. Now, if there ever was a way to get Reignition to your graveyard from your banishment, you'd actually be able to activate it on your first turn of the game. This is because cards that are banished and returned to the graveyard are not considered to have been sent to the graveyard this turn, so if you find a way to do that, you could use Reignition on your first turn. It's not likely, and it is a once per duel effect, so you might want to save it for the follow-up when you have a battle phase, so you can just OTK and kill your opponent. It is possible to banish this card using something like Pot of Desires and returning it to the graveyard with the third effect of Infernoid Tiara, which returns 3 cards from the banished zone to the graveyard for both players. And there will be combos in the future that you could use that involve hand looping your opponent, which will be available once the Fiendsmith archetype is legal. You'll be able to turn 1, hand loop your opponent, and resolve the effect of Tiara for hand loop and returning banished cards, milling 3, and sending 3 from the extra deck to the graveyard. So you could, if you could find a way to get Reignition into the banished zone, you can then return it to the graveyard and use it that turn. Although you could still set up the graveyard and just use it next turn, so there really is no need to go that far out of your way to find a method that will allow you to do this. Void Breach is our next spell card. It's a continuous spell card with the continuous effect that increases the attack of all Infernoid monsters you control by 100 for each currently banished Infernoid monster, as well as it has an ignition effect that can do one of 2 different things. You choose on activation, and these effects are hard once per turn, so you can only use one of them, and you can only use it once that turn, regardless of how many copies of the card you have. And it says if you control no monsters, or the only monsters you control are fiend monsters, you can add a banished Infernoid from your graveyard to your hand, which is useful when you can add Decatron or a small Infernoid that you can special summon from your hand by banishing Infernoids from your hand or graveyard. Or if you happen to have a big Infernoid in your hand, you can simply special it from your hand, because the Infernoids tend to have a level restriction, and this will allow you to cut around the level restriction, as this does ignore the summoning condition of the Infernoid monster. So it allows you to special summon an Infernoid from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions, which means that if you can get 2 Infernoids at your level limit onto the field, this can give you that ability to get that 3rd one you need in order to OTK your opponent. Also, the attack boost is a big deal because a lot of the Infernoid weaknesses have always been from their attacks being slightly too low. Not that they're that small, but some of these monsters would just be so much better if they can break 3000 attack. Infernoid Sightsmoss has 2600 attack, and at the end of the battle phase, if you battle the monster, you can banish a card on the field. Because it had 2600 attack, often you'd have to attack into non-threats before you can banish the actual threats, or you'd have to attack into a monster in defense position, just so that you can use its effect to banish something. But if you can get it up to like 3100, you can attack over the actual threat and then banish alternative cards. Same thing goes for Infernoid Evil. If it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can activate its effect to attack again. It has to be a monster in the graveyard, otherwise you can't activate the effect. But often you'd have to be dealing with one monster that's below 3000 attack and another one that's over 3000 attack. And you can only really kill one of them, so having the ability to attack twice was meaningless. So if you can raise Etondel's attack to over 3000, odds are you'll be able to attack over two monsters quite often. And since you have to play multiple names for a lot of the Infernoid effects that are going to be coming out in the new set, cards like Infernoid Piatti were very weak without the added attack boost, because 2200 pretty much made its effect completely useless. It has to inflict battle damage over an opponent's monster, and then you can make them send a card from their hand to the graveyard. With 2200 attack, it was very rare that you ever were attacking into anything, and if you were, not inflicting damage. Piatti being level 5 is useful for one of the engines you can play in the Infernoid deck going forward, which is going to be the Chimera engine. Chimera Fusion can be searched by normal summoning Gazelle, King of the Mythical Claws, or by summoning Big Wing Berfomet off of Mirror Sword Knight to search for Chimera Fusion. Now, Gazelle can also search for a level 5 Fiend, so it can be used to search for your Infernoid Piatti to ensure you have additional names in your hand if you already opened your Chimera Fusion, which can be used to fusion summon your Infernoid Evil, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, because Infernoid Breach does ignore summoning conditions and doesn't negate the monster that you summon, if you have Infernoid Inoku in your hand or Infernoid Deviati, you can just immediately summon them to Dark Hole or Heavy Storm your opponent's field while also having an opposite negate attached to them. Inoku has a spell trap negate after it Dark Holes, so if your opponent has Imperm to try and stop Inoku from using the Dark Hole effect, you can negate the infinite impermanence. Similarly, you can use Deviati to Harpy's Feather Duster your opponent's field, and if they try to negate it with something like Appaloosa, you can chain the Devi to negate the Appaloosa, allowing you to both destroy the back row and clear your field while also negating the threat. Often you're going to be using Infernoid Evil to search for your Void Vanishment at the end of your combo, and often you might send all your Infernoids from deck to grave using Infernoid Evil's effect. So if you don't actually have a live Void Feast that you can actually resolve with the Infernoid you want to send to the graveyard, it might be better to search for Void Breach as your secondary target, because you can at least summon a monster from your hand with it, while also beefing up your guys, or add back your Decatron for your normal summon if you didn't use one already. If you resolve Evil, you can always put your Decatron into the graveyard, you can always banish it, and then you can always use your Evil to add a Breach, and then use Breach to add the Decatron to your hand, so you can use it for your normal summon. Our first new monster is Infernoid Flood, is a Link 4 Fire Fiend effect monster with 3000 attack, and can be link summoned using 2+ monsters, including at least one Infernoid monster. This will most often be Promethean Princess, Bestower of Flames, and additionally a Decatron, an Infernoid Evil, or an Infernoid Sierra, as those are the only cards you can revive off of Promethean Princess, as the Infernoids cannot be special summoned from the graveyard other than by their own condition or a card that ignores their summoning. Now, cards that ignore summoning condition can actually only summon monsters from where the place that they normally are located, which is either your hand, your deck, or your extra deck. So you can summon Infernoids ignoring your summoning conditions using the effect of Flood, which we'll talk about in a moment, or Void Feast. The other Infernoids can't be summoned with Promethean Princess, as they must be summoned using their own card text, some of which can only be summoned from the graveyard, and some of which can be summoned from the hand. So it's possible that you can just hard summon one of them in order to link off into Flood, and then we'll get into Flood's effects. Honestly, just having a link 4 you can go in through with Promethean Princess is one of my favorite features of Infernoid Flood. It is a Fiend monster, so if you get Fiend locked, if you want to play like an Unchained engine, which is a pretty cool thing you can do in the Infernoid deck, link into a Link to Yama, and then search for your Shavara, then use it to summon to make your Promethean Princess, searching a Void Trap, a Unchained Trap, and then using the Promethean Princess to revive your Decatron and then go into Flood to unlock yourself from fires is a pretty good feature. While I didn't mind going into Ambloel or Salamangreat Raging Phoenix, they weren't my preferable summons. I've been waiting for Infernoid Flood to fill that role for a while. Flood has 3 effects, the first of which is it can negate the inherent summon of a monster that your opponent would do by tributing a monster you control, and it banishes that monster, which means that if you were to use it against something like Typhon's effect would not be in play, as its summon is in question of being successful or not. So you can use Flood to negate the summon of Typhon. Its second effect is that if a card is banished from your graveyard, you can banish one card in the field and it does not target. But it is a little difficult to banish a card from your graveyard on your opponent's turn. It is a trigger effect, so you can use it whenever it would happen, once per turn. All the effects of Flood are hard once per turn. There's only one card in the Infernoid deck that can be banished on your opponent's turn, realistically using only engine cards, and that's Void Seer, which is not often played, although Void Seer probably isn't as bad with the current iterations of Infernoid we'll be playing going forward, as Void Seer makes your guys unaffected by card effects, which means it could be used to act as like Called by the Grave. When your Infernoid Evil goes off, your opponent might throw Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence or Valor or Ghostmourner at it to prevent it from going off. And technically, Void Seer is the only card that stops all of them. When Void Seer's in the graveyard, if one of your Infernoids would be destroyed by card effect, you can banish it instead. which would allow you to trigger Flood. But during your turn, it's pretty easy to trigger Flood. All you have to do is summon an Infernoid, and then you'll be triggering Flood to banish a card on the field. And because it doesn't target, so you should only activate it in a scenario where your opponent will have a card, otherwise you will have to banish your own card. Now, if you play the Unchained package, you'll often have cards like Soul of Yama in the graveyard, which you can use to trigger this effect of Flood, so you can still trigger it on your opponent's turn by destroying one of your own cards. If you're playing the Unchained engine, it shouldn't be that hard to trigger Yama in order to, one, summon back a Decatron to set up a negate, while also triggering Flood in order to banish a card on the field. The last effect only works if Flood is link summoned, which says that if this card is destroyed by your opponent's card, which includes battle or card effect, you can special summon an Infernoid from your deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, which means this card could be ashed, except if it was destroyed by battle, in which case this would occur during the damage step, in which case you can't negate the effect with ash. It has to say ignoring the summoning conditions because the Infernoids have conditions on themselves that say they can't be summoned by other ways. So you can special summon Anoku or Deviati and use their effects to board wipe, possibly even during the damage step, because their effects are not negated, and they can ignore the restriction of the level limits when summoned this way. If you're playing something like the Chimera Fusion engine I mentioned earlier, you can use this to trigger the effect of Flood to banish a card by banishing your Chimerica, King of the Mythical Phantom Beast, or the Fusion Berformet to special back your destroyed or banished fiends, your Decatrons, or your Yama, if you play that as well, in order to trigger the effect of Flood. All of Flood effects are hard once per turns, unlike most other Infernoid card in the game, which all of the effects of Infernoid Flood are hard once per turns, so if it should be destroyed, you can revive it with something like Yama and use all of its effects with the exception of the one when it must be link summoned, which is to summon from deck, because by summoning it from the graveyard, it won't be link summoned. But if you didn't get a chance to negate an inherent summon or banish a card in the field, you can bring back your Flood using either Chimera, Mythical Chimera of the Phantom Beast, or by Yama in order to trigger its effect before your turn is over. And the last card, the card that everyone is playing Infernoid for, is Infernoid Evil, which is a level 1 Fire Fusion effect monster with 1100 attack and defense. Its level means that you can summon it from the graveyard or banish zone, or add it back to your extra deck using Snake Eye Oak. So it does work well with the Snake Eye deck. As a matter of fact, there are Snake Eye combos that do the full Infernoid play, which I'll share at the end of this video as tip 5. By returning your Flood from the banish zone to the field, you can then link it off again in order to activate its effect once again. The effects on Infernoid Evil are once per turn, so it has an effect on Fusion Summon and an effect when it's sent from the graveyard or banished. Then you can add a Void card from your deck to your hand. So returning it to the field to link it off again could give you additional triggers of Evil turn over turn as you play through your game. It's also, if properly summoned, one of the only cards you can summon off of Promethean Princess. Its attack stat's pretty useless for playing things like the Nadir Servant package, as its attack is 1100, which means you have to dump it with Nadir Servant, you could only search for Dogmatica Aiden, as you must search a monster with less than attack of the monster you dump from the extra deck to the graveyard. But if you just want to use the Infernoid engine in the deck to set up some negates using Anokus and Deviatis, you can activate Nadir Servant, search for Aiden, use Evil to search for Void Vanishment, then discard the Aiden to search for Void Feast and set Void Feast. So at minimum, you can do that with the Nadir Servant package, which could be a good backup engine to play in the deck. Or you can just search for Ecclesia, use Ecclesia to search for Maximus, and then use Maximus to dump your Evil for you. But then you have to worry about your opponent playing cards that they can dump from their extra deck to the graveyard that might mess up your plays. And there are a decent amount of cards you can dump from the extra deck to the graveyard to go in combination with your Evil. You can set up the Chimera Fusions to either bring back your Infernoids from your graveyard or your banish zone. You could set up Yamas to allow you to summon back additional Decatrons. So there are reasons to play Maximus, but it might be something you might want to side deck instead of main deck, just in the event that your opponent has cards that might go plus off of it. Unusually, it's probably easiest to actually just hard fusion summon Infernoid Evil. Its materials are just 2 Infernoid monsters, so if you can just have 2 Infernoids in your hand along with a fusion spell, you can just use polymerization to summon it, which is actually the reason why the Chimera engine is something that I'm experimenting with. You can normal summon Gazelle, King of Mythical Claws, or use Mirror Sword Knight to summon Gazelle, and use it to search for Chimera Fusion, which is just polymerization as a quick effect. It's as long as you have used fiends for the fusion materials. Since the Infernoids are fiends, you can use them to do this. You can also use Chimera Fusion to summon Chimera, King of the Mythical Phantom Beasts, and then use the effect of the graveyard, use the graveyard effect of Chimera Fusion to add it back to hand, and then hard summon Evil. And maybe you can set up a Cornfield Codal to set up targeting protection for your Evil. Although odds are they would probably negate the effect of the Gazelle if they could do that. If you don't mind getting locked into fusions, you can use Big Berformet instead of Gazelle to search for your Chimera Fusion. Gazelle can also search for your Piatti, and Berformet can also search for Gazelle. So you can trick your opponent into putting their negates onto your Gazelle package so that you can resolve your Infernoid cards, while also giving you more ways to search polymerization. Because the fusion material for evil is so simple, it's just 2 Infernoids, you can also resolve Imagination on your first turn more often. So if you just open Imagination plus 2 Infernoids, you can use Imagination to fusion summon evil by sending 2 Infernoids from your hand to the graveyard, and then you can activate evil's on-field effect. When evil is fusion summoned, you can banish 1 Infernoid from your graveyard and send Infernoids with different names from your deck to the graveyard equal to the level of the sent monster. Now, this is mandatory in the sense that you can't just send up to the number of names sent. So if you actually open an Oku and you don't play 10 names, you actually can't trigger the effect. But if you have like your Sajet, you can trigger it and send 6 names if you have 6 names in deck. If you draw some awkward number of level names Infernoids, you might not be able to resolve evil. But if you don't resolve evil to dump a bunch of Infernoids to set up your turn 1 combo, that just means that you're guaranteed to have a live Void Feast to set up off of your Void Banishment when you link off your Infernoid Evil. One of the other things people are doing is they're playing Dark Fusion to hard fusion summon evil, because then it says your guy can't be targeted that's fusion summoned, and Dark Fusion summons fiends. So you can play Dark Fusion, you can play Evil Hero Adusted Gold to search for Dark Fusion, you can play Elemental Hero Stratos to search for Adusted Gold to search for Dark Fusion. If you really want to get crazy, you can get Dark Fusion to your hand. It's not a problem. It's also interesting thrust targets. If your opponent should negate one of your plays, you can use thrust to search for Dark Fusion in order to get your plays going. Instant Fusion is also a 1-card evil, but evil's effect to banish an Infernoid from grave and mill is only useful if you have Infernoids in grave, so you might want to try the Predaplant engine. You can normal Orphis Scorpio, pitch an Infernoid to graveyard, so there's 1 in graveyard for your evil to use for the mill effect. You can then use Scorpio to summon Darling Tony and Cobra. Cobra can then search for Instant Fusion, which you can then activate. You can also set up because this gives you 2 level 3s, you could also set up a Cherubini and dump level 3s to the graveyard if you want. So you could at the very minimum dump an Infernoid Harmodic from your deck to the graveyard to make sure there's at least something to banish from the graveyard. Now we'll talk about the 1-card combos. There's a 1-card combo that uses Snake Guy Ash. There's a 2-card combo that uses Dia Bellstar, the Black Witch. The Snake Eye engine allows you to get into the Infernoid Evil using Proxy F Magician, so you don't actually have to play a fusion card or open any Infernoid cards at all. So there's really not too many ways to gain access to your Infernoid cards except for Snake Eye Ash or by using Original Sinful Spoils, so this gives you a way to get into the combo without having access to the actual engine. Then there's your 3-card combo that's just any two Infernoid monster and a fusion spell that can be resolved, which will allow you to fusion summon evil and then set up a big board. I'll link to videos using these, as I haven't tested a lot of them myself, but the combos are available and they are out there. But I mostly just wanted to share tips regarding what the options are that are available and things you should consider when building or playing your deck. If you found this useful, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.